It is Thursday. We are officially getting closer and closer to our homecoming game, but welcome to homecoming week. If you guys are physically in town with us, make sure to check our roundup emails, our alumni socials, all of our social medias for all of our really cool events. We've got Cowboy Lounge happening on Friday. We have our homecoming game that starts on Saturday at noon. I mean 1. I always get those times mixed up. And so without further ado, I will turn the time over to Dr. Chadborn, who is going to give our first HU talk of the day, titled Shadows on the Edge of Town, Ghosts, Monsters, and the Shaping of Community.
Hi, thank you. Let me share my screen. I can never remember if I labeled it on the edge of town or at the edge of town. So it's going to change as we get through it. So let's, all right. Is it showing the full presentation? Just to.
Yep, it shows the full one.
Great. All right. So I guess I need to start with what this is. This is kind of an overview of some of the research my colleagues and lab are working on, and some kind of broad theoretical questions that we've been asking about how ghost stories, local legends, folklore, whatever it may be, relate to community connection and involvement. And so this is going to get very, I don't know what the right word is, maybe theoretical, I guess. Hypothetical might be a better word for that. So what this presentation is, and what I'm going to be talking about today is sort of how the collective consciousness of a community, and kind of how to talk about collective consciousness, or the collective unconscious, as maybe Yoon had talked about it, within the context of kind of a modern psych perspective, and how this collective consciousness of a community can help shape, build, and form around these stories that members of the community tell. And specifically in this case around fears and concerns of past generations, and how that can shape stories and essentially create monsters for newer generations. I'm not saying, as sort of a disclaimer, because I've got lots of disclaimers here, I'm not really saying that this is bad, but it's sort of examining ways in which Jungian concepts in a modern context can play out in social settings. So to kind of set up some logic for future research that we're going to be working on, and examining how social information spreads, and how it's tied to community folklore. So the problem, though, with all of this is that Freud and Jung and his mentor Freud aren't really looked at too highly in psychology. Their works are very hypothetical, or theoretical, or really hypothetical. There's not a lot of theory, but there isn't a lot to study with it. And so they were engaging in observations. Jung especially was very interested in, almost to a level of like Eastern mysticism, with this idea of a collective unconscious. And because of this, we don't really focus on them nearly as much as we could, or maybe even should. And so part of what I want to do here is talk a little bit about Jung, and talk about how his research can be applied in sort of a modern social context. Maybe not as a collective unconscious, but a collective consciousness as part of this. So what I'm going to try to do is kind of talk about modern theory and this historical perspective, and also talk about some modern research that's being done with Jung, and then kind of lump that in to what we're doing in our lab, and what we're kind of planning to do in the future regarding some folklore and interviews that we're going to have with people in the community, hopefully. So some further disclaimers. Again, with that, the limit of high theory, and some warnings up front. I am going to be talking about some less than savory aspects of community I'm going to be talking about local folklore and legends that are not pleasant, particularly revolving around like La Llorona and other shadows at the edge of town, for lack of a better phrase. And so there will be some less than savory topics brought up because of the nature of those stories. Um, so one of the things that we could think about with this is that when we talk about Yoon's collective unconsciousness, we can actually kind of reframe it in a modern sense around this sort of like cloud. My mentor used to always say that we've got like the person, the environment, and we have the social cloud, this nebulous collective of stories and interactions amongst people and the people that they know and the people that they know. And so we can kind of think about this in terms of knowledge or memes or whatever it may be as this broad social information that passes down, and that generation after generation, we may forget where these stories come from, but the core, the crux of those stories sort of sit within our consciousness in some way. And so again, we forget the who, the what, the where, the when, the why, or the how the event happened, but it transforms, it spreads, and those who follow the advice or the heed the warnings of the story, they survive to pass it along. And so we're talking about, don't go play down by the river. In terms of La Llorona, we're talking about don't go into the forest if we're talking about European folklore around the Fae or the fairy folk. And this also includes other remedios or remedies that we, our parents or grandparents may have passed down to us. But these stories stick with us for one reason or another. I think I'm jumping ahead from my notes. So this is kind of what I was getting at. This is Carl Jung meets Kurt Lewin. Kurt Lewin's the father of social psychology, and kind of looks at this idea of how the social environment impacts us. So the questions that I'm, sort of asking with my students and colleagues are, why do these stories exist? What is the purpose of these stories? So, again, don't go by the river because it's dangerous. Don't go into the woods because it's dangerous. Use this particular herb because it's helpful. That these stories help the community or help the family unit or the group in some meaningful way. We don't really have to contemplate their existence. We don't have to argue whether or not the ghost in the Plaza Hotel is real, but it serves some purpose, or it's there for some reason within the community, is kind of the argument that I'm getting at. So first, I'll start off with what we're doing. So what have we done and where are we going with this identity and community folklore study that we're working on? We've only completed an initial study, and we're getting ready to launch a couple of more. And this initial study examined some of the stories and folklore of the campus community. And so we sent it out to the campus, and they responded back with about 120 participants, 100 of ish, which were from NMHU. And so we've got about 100 people from the community or from the college who, or at least live within the New Mexico area, who've kind of shared with us a number of different stories. And so these stories included things like, what are remedies that grandma and grandpa used, or that your aunts and uncles used? What are ways in which you can determine a pregnancy or the gender of a child in pregnancy? And specifically, what are some of the legends, the ghosts? So lots of hauntings, but beyond the general hauntings in like every place around Vegas, there are a couple of monsters that are mentioned. And the most reported monsters in that case are La Llorona, skinwalkers, or sort of evil shaman in Native American legend, and El Cucuy, which is, if you've never heard of them, they're sort of like a boogeyman, but it's a very regionally exclusive boogeyman. So we also got feedback on some rituals, remedies, and beliefs the participants' families have had. regarding healing and like I mentioned, gender predictions in utero. We will be talking more about this as we move forward, and so we're working on kind of parsing apart all of this, but I'm going to focus on the monsters today. So the stories that and the reports that we got were really insightful, but they only give us sort of secondhand knowledge, and that's kind of where we're going with this. Is that we just ask people, what were you told growing up? Not do you believe this? Not do you agree with these stories? Just what were you told? And this made it really kind of difficult to assess like the sense of community with this, because everyone that we talked to had a pretty decent sense. We used a sense of community scale, so they had a pretty decent sense of their connection to the community that was really high across the board. But we weren't really assessing belief, and whether or not they also agreed that these things worked, which some of them make sense, that there are herbs and local remedies that are, you know, backed up with constant use again and again. There are also, you know, people who reported that, like, it's not just that my grandparents or parents said use Vicks Vapor Rub, it was to eat it. And that's maybe not the best idea. And so, like, there's this different level in belief, and maybe usefulness with some of these. So it's insightful, but secondhand. And our next steps are to kind of take that a step further, to go and talk to people who either work or engage at these places that are supposedly haunted, to talk to people more directly about stories and experiences that they've had. And again, we're not looking to stigmatize anyone who has these stories. We're looking to understand kind of what these stories mean to them, how they experience these stories, and examine kind of the effect that these stories have, and how they're tied to their connection to the community. You know, if being more connected to the community does mean that you understand these stories, or that these stories are closer to you in some meaningful way. So, and again, regardless of belief, that's an important aspect, because there's not discounting that someone seeing something down by, you know, the Guyanus River and understanding it as some sort of ghost or spectral force is their perception of the world. And what we know in psychology is that perception can change greatly based on one's own background, or view. And to very briefly plug probably my favorite study of all time in social psychology to kind of explain this is, Hastorf and Cantrell ran a study. It's very short. It's about 3 pages if you want to read it. And they looked at a football game. And so there was a particular call at this football game. And what they found is, in interviewing participants, I believe it was Stanford and Dartmouth, this is back in the 50s, they found that depending on what side of the field you were on, completely changed your perception of that play. And so if you could think back to any football game that's had a questionable event, depending on what side of the team or what team you're rooting for, you perceive things differently. And it is reality for those individuals. It becomes real. Your perception, your understanding, your interpretation changes based on your identification towards the groups that you belong to. And so what does football have to do with folklore in the Southwest is that if you're really connected to a community and you're at the Plaza Hotel and you hear something or experience something you can't explain, it's a ghost. It's the ghost at the Plaza. And that's real. Whether or not you want to argue that the ghost exists, it's a kind of real perceptual feeling for you. And so I kind of want to take this into the scientific realm and say, you know, we can't really study the existence of the ghost, but we can study how people explain unexplainable events based on how their community, or what they've learned from their community. So let's talk about Yoon with this. So with that introduction, let's talk about the archetypes and monsters that exist. So whether we're talking about dark figures and shadows, and in order to talk about the shadows, we have to talk about what kind of exists in the light. So if you've never heard of Yoon, one of like the most famous psychologists, who's not that studied by kind of quote unquote mainstream psychology, Yoon was really interested in this idea of these archetypes, these collective concepts that exist across human experience, that all groups share these core archetypes. So they're defined depending on where you look, but typically these are two pretty good definitions: primordial, universal, ahistoric. So they exist beyond kind of our historic understanding. Images situated in the undermost levels of human unconsciousness. This collective unconsciousness is what Jung called it. We can also define them that saying that archetypes are not whimsical inventions, but autonomous elements. They come out of our natural human experiences, and that they live within this unconscious psyche, which they were before any invention was thought of. So we don't have to create the concept of, let's say, the mother or the creator or the devil or the trickster. That these are concepts that we understood before we started telling stories about them. And it's very likely that they're tied to kind of a baseline of human behavior. You know, we have people who engage in trickery and subterfuge for good or evil. We have the light and the darkness. We have good and evil as concepts. We have mother figures and father figures because we are raised by mothers and fathers, or individuals who kind of take those places as caregivers. And we also have other aspects of ourselves, like the anima and the animus, which represent kind of the male and female sides of our psyche. And so they kind of go beyond this. They represent the unalterable structure of the psychic world. And you can think of this as more the psychological world, in which reality is attested by the determining effects it has upon the conscious mind. So all of that just sort of means that we kind of have these concepts buried deep within our consciousness, and sometimes they come out. And how they come out is depending on what's going on around us, but they represent kind of baselines of us, the human psyche, as it were. So these archetypical figures typically represent events, motifs, figures, or aspects. They're not really pinned down as just creatures, or people, or but they can also be, again, certain events or concepts. The way Jung described it, and the way it's really better described in like Eastern philosophy, is that we kind of share these stories and other concepts, and so we can look at like similar mythology or similar stories across social structures or social groups, and we see similarities in them, and those similarities would be archetypes. In a modern sense, they would be something like tropes or certain memes that are kind of similar across all groups. So some basic ones: the god, the devil, the trickster, and the hero are all pretty easy to understand. These are all examples of common elements to stories. So you have like a good and evil, a creator figure, or a creator and a destroyer. The trickster, and even the devil doesn't have to be bad. We can look at like early biblical views of the devil as sort of just a tempter. He's one of, you know, God's angels meant to tempt Jesus in the desert. We have the trickster. So we could talk about like Anansi or Coyote as examples of like trickster deities. Again, they're not bad, they're not good, but they can serve various purposes in stories. Loki would be another example of that. And then, of course, the hero, this sort of mythological figure who, you know, does good deeds and saves people in need. What I will kind of touch on with some of the stories that we've heard are two in particular: the mother, and who's sort of the life bringer, the caregiver. It's also associated with a number of other traits. And then the sage, or the wise one. And I don't want to kind of gender this, because it's either the wise man or the wise woman. They can both be the sage, but this is sort of the healer, the guider. It'd be like your shaman or your medicine man or woman. This is the person who offers sage advice. It can also be tied to, there's another archetypical figure called the wounded healer, and this is sort of the sage who heals, or the healer who heals who has hurt themselves or who has been through pain themselves. And then it gets us to the shadow. The shadow is not really kind of an entity, it's more of a concept. Jung and other Jungian psychologists kind of describe the shadow as the emotional blind spot of the self. It's the part of us that we're not really aware of, and it doesn't really represent the best of us. It represents kind of our basest instincts. And what's interesting is if we kind of look at some of the research that's been done on this, modern takes by Herbert and Hamilton and others, this is where I'm going to get a little abstract, is that they argue that when ideas from these archetypes emerge in our consciousness, while these archetypes, according to Jung, are ahistorical and acultural, they become cultural and historical when they enter our consciousness. And so we manifest similar stories, but they manifest within our conscious understanding. And so again, the woman down by the river who might drown a child is culturally tied to a more local context, whereas the creatures in the woods who will take children away, like the fairy folk in Northern European or European myth, they're the same concept, the same type of archetype, and a warning to not go and play in nature or not mess with nature, but they manifest with historical and cultural images. And so we can kind of take this idea that, like, if we take that concept of they saw a game, that our understanding and our group involvement in our community affects how we think about similar stories and context. So, like, the images, while the archetypes are universal, they manifest in cultural and historical ways. So basically, the concepts exist at a deep level of consciousness, and I'm not going to use unconsciousness. I'll just say deep consciousness. They're beyond our normal awareness, but when they come out, we experience and understand them within the context of our own personal, cultural, and social experiences. So, again, the Fae, La Llorona, and other creatures that go bump in the night, they share a common underlying fear. The same thing can be said with how normal archetypes manifest within negative thoughts. And so the power of these archetypes and what makes them archetypes is also tied, according to some of these researchers, as or with the emotions tied to them. So if they're positive emotions, we see things like the mother in a positive light. But when they're tied to sort of the shadow, these negative, dark, base emotions, they become more negative. So again, a skinwalker would be example of a sage gone bad. So it would be someone who was meant to heal, but has turned to dark magic, or turned to the shadow, or turned to some unsavory practice. And so it's sort of a dark warning of kind of the good and evil nature of using one's power to heal. So, again, positive and negative, light and shadow, as it were, they're key to manifesting archetypes, according to Jungian researchers. And so, and I use this as like psychological manifestation, not like physical, but, again, our psychological understanding of the world could make us see things or interpret things that aren't necessarily there. I want to double check my time. So, how does this work with some modern stories, or some of these stories? Louise Anaz and Seif kind of talk about archetypes within the realm of La Llorona, or the Dark Mother, and that they kind of look at aspects of how monsters or haunting sort of flip the script. And so for Louise Anaz, archetypes act as the emotional source in narratives. They play into the collective functions that resonate between all of us. We actually see similarities with the kind of Dark Mother archetype in Catholicism, with both the distant father and the Holy Mother, and then it gets sort of flipped into a very absolutist, what they call the flaming absolute. This sort of like not sort of like a burning bush, but a righteous, angry God. And then the kind of flip side to the Holy Mother would be sort of a Dark Mother archetype. Let's see here. Wow. So one of the things that they mention here, I'll mention, like, for the patient involved or the client involved, The last example of transference, of kind of transferring one's emotions onto, and this is from Louise Anaz's work, is that the transference is contained in this archetypical image of the Holy Mother, or someone, a kind of mother figure that can keep them safe, and that can be flipped if negative emotion is involved, into the perception of sort of a dark or not protective mother. I'll kind of, there we go. And the same, this is kind of tied into the work of Seif, 2019, who looks at the idea of kind of the dark mother, or shadow nature, as it were, which is sort of like a anti-Madonna figure. It's a holy mother, the holy mother is there to pray to and keep us safe, but it's twisted into sort of a dark or unholy mother who acts as a monster towards the community, or a monster towards the family. Further arguments kind of focus on this as the shadow of nature, or how the shadow mother acts as a force around dark explanations or unsavory explanations around motherhood, including abandonment, infanticide, and how again, this works within the cultural context of when you have these negative events show up in the community, how does a community cope with them, or how does a community interact with them? They also note that this aspect doesn't really fit within that doesn't really fit within kind of a modern cultural consciousness, and that we remember where they come from. It can also be tied and buried into old standing lore and old standing stories around shameful feelings or oppression, or with some of the modern research. There's a researcher, couple of modern Jungian researchers, who have looked at the Dark Mother, who also tie it to even old European or even Aztec origins, regarding these really old stories that have sort of transferred with us into our kind of modern cultural consciousness. I'll read this from the Aztec myth. The sixth bad omen. The people heard a weeping woman night after night. She passed by in the night, in the middle of the night, waiting and wailing and crying in a loud voice. My children, we must flee far away from the city. At other times she tried, my children, where shall I take you? And so these are not new stories that we're looking at. That's kind of part of where this idea of the archetype and this idea of the this kind of collective consciousness or collective unconsciousness comes from. I'll also mention this other because I found it really fascinating, is that Hamilton in 2020 also looked at trauma survivors and how PTSD and other traumas can manifest in monsters and even dreams and hallucinations. He looked at nightmares and visions when experiencing post-traumatic stress, thinking about how manifestations of stories, tales, and the most basic archetypes into something like a terrible mother or an ultra-authoritarian creator, a corrupted healer, etc., may have manifested once amongst community members and spread as reality, and for people become reality. There are others like Seraph who look at this in relation to longstanding stories of oppression, and then how some of the early background of La Llorona might even come out of Aztec stories during colonialism by Cortez and others. So let me try to put this all together as I'm finishing. So basically, archetypes represent the most basic unit of conscious knowledge. When they manifest into consciousness, they take on images related to culture. Positive and negative emotion can shape these images, and basically they develop into modern cultural stories tied to similar tales. The monsters are the same, but they're different. They're different because of the cultural subtext of them. So Fae in the Woods, Crying Woman at the Lake, they're essentially the same. And if we take this from the next step, one of the things that I kind of mentioned, that when tied to trauma or oppression, they can take on aspects of this sort of Jungian shadow. Like I said, Herbert looks at these shadow archetypes through collective oppression, and that, again, early stories tied to women and these kind of Aztec tales during the time of Cortez, to modern colonial oppression and trauma can also manifest through certain events. There seems to be some evidence in literature kind of tying early stories of um, these individuals within communities to like the La Llorona tale, for instance. Yeah, I mentioned Hamilton with PTSD manifesting monsters. So basically, the person's ideas transmit to the community or group. So with this in mind, we're kind of looking at it in one of oh, okay. We're kind of looking at this in one of three ways. First is the idea of kind of trauma and its relation to modern folk devils. So basically, communities, cultures, and groups will also will often develop targets outside the group. This actually helps to create some level of group bonding or group identity solidification due to kind of an us versus them mentality. And so we could look at something like this with La Llorona as communal historical trauma, that there's some outside force that may have created this entity. In addition, that someone who would engage in that behavior. So if we talk about kind of the view of La Llorona as this woman who ends up drowning her children after being spurned by the father of those children, that is not what the community would stand for. And so this person becomes this entity that kind of exists within the borders of the town. That this is not what normal people in the community do. We don't do this, and so this is a monster now. Or as a warning to those who might think that this is something that I might have this impulse to engage in. And we see the same thing today. We see the same thing with individuals looking at kind of horrors within the community as an outside folk devil, as this creature. So whether we talk about the witch trials or the satanic panic or modern, I mean, there's now new articles about the resurgence or the continuation of the satanic panic. So this idea of individuals within the community engaging in predation on children, it's not necessarily as easy to say this is coming from within the community. It has to be an us versus them sort of thing. And in order to kind of maintain some of that buffer, the monsters exist within the outskirts. They exist within the basements. They're demons or devils. They're possessed, whatever it may be. And so these stories rise up out of these concerns that a community has. So it's sort of an explanation of bad events, bad people, and the like. I'm going to kind of jump ahead because I'm running out of time. And in addition to this, so besides the stories used to help buffer some of those negative views, they also help to guide us. And so we're talking about don't play by the river, don't play in the forest, don't eat this certain thing, don't do this certain thing. They act as sort of rules for the community. Monsters and the creatures that exist at the edge of town are violators of social norms. And so we have rules in our community, and the monsters violate them. This is, these monsters do terrible things. They hurt people. They engage in, consistent violations. And not only are they violators of norms, but in some cases they can be punishments for those violations. So La Llorona represents an example of this as an entity that not only violates the norms, but the constant, pain that the entity feels is tied to their initial violation of that norm. So they continue to harm because they engaged in this bad behavior to start with. And so they keep children from playing in the river, and they also act as a cautionary tale for mothers who harm their children. And we see these sort of same things pop up in other cultures as well, as fables, parables, folklore, as ways in which individuals in the community survive. And then because of this, they help to build the boundaries of the community. This is kind of the last stage of what we're thinking about with this. They act as sort of an us versus them. Those who violate the norms are them. Those who break the rules of society are them. The monsters are the them. versus us, the people in the community doing the right thing. The same could be said if we're talking about, let's say, a skinwalker. We're talking about evil shaman or dark shaman, individuals who have violated the taboos of the magic or the power that they wield. And again, this is in the absence of a real threat. And I'll say that as a question mark because some of these may come from real threats within the community. We talk about things like the satanic panic, and what we've learned about, let's say, predators within a community is that some communities will engage in some level of cognitive dissonance to feel better and say, oh, it's not us. It's not the good people in the community. It's this one outlier. In social psych, we call those norm violators. It's the black sheep effect, that the community typically pushes out the black sheep. They're not a real member of the community. It's a little different if it's a leader or something like that. So some broad thoughts: monsters and creatures in the dark act as a catharsis for underlying fears. They help to kind of reduce some of those fears by putting them onto something else. Supernatural creatures are a way for a community to process, remember, or work through oppression, trauma, whatever it may be. And some other problems can occur when real issues within the group are attributed to folk devils or outsiders. And that basically all of these help to create certain boundaries within the community. So not like physical town boundaries of like where the outskirts of town, but literally, or psychological boundaries for where the community exists. Who is a member versus who isn't a member. All right. I hope I didn't get too abstract with that. And I'll thank you for your time. Before I kind of take any thoughts or questions, I'll thank our folklore team, myself, Dr. Brooks, Dr. Ritter, Cole Reiben, Alyssa Allen, and Annika O'Brien, who are also all working on this project this semester. I'd like to give them full credit for all the work that they're doing and will do. Stop my sharing.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for that, Dr. Chadborn. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts for him?
I think Dr. Gadsden has a question.
Go ahead.
I do. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Chadborn. So I have two questions, actually. The first one is, I'm wondering, have you started looking at changes over time and then what those changes might be linked to in terms of what might have happened to that society or that community?
It's a great question. That's definitely something we're probably going to be looking at. We realized early on that asking people like, have you heard these stories, wasn't enough, that we need to go out and talk to people. And we want to, look at how age, generational differences, socioeconomic status, a number of other factors might influence this. I mean, we're definitely likely to see some differences amongst, let's say, like people and their grandparents and how important these stories are, or what stories are important to them, as we're a more interconnected society.
Definitely, like which ones actually have carried over across several generations, or
Yes.
and if they have carried over, how have they changed and why have they changed?
Absolutely.
Definitely. And so, yeah, you just touched on my